You can now support Ghost Maps on Patreon and buy our official merchandise on Redbubble. Simply look for We Are HANTU or click the links in the description. Ghost Maps, Entry 29, Semarang, Indonesia. Agung hasn't been in Southeast Asia for a little over 20 years. His family moved to San Francisco for his father's job when he was 10, and he's lived there ever since. He's been in Singapore now for about a week for work of his own, but he made it a point to stop by Indonesia first. That's where his family hails from, specifically a town in Semarang called Banyumanik. When a mutual friend found out that he'd been in Singapore, they arranged for us to meet up. Sitting at a cafe in the heart of the CBD, sipping his flat white, Agung tells me that visiting his extended family in Semarang was eye-opening and enlightening for a number of reasons. The most important for him was getting back in touch with his roots. San Fran's all I've known for most of my life, he says. It's my home, but not my culture. And that disconnect has always made me feel a little lost. He says that even something as simple as speaking Bahasa with his relatives felt like such a big deal to him. Of course, there were other reasons why his visit to Indonesia was so eventful. So, I was having tea with my Uncle Faisal, my mum's brother, Agung says. He used to live next door to us in our apartment when I was a kid. I was just reminiscing about that place when he gave me this knowing smirk. I ask him what that smirk meant, and he responds with a smile of his own. One that's decidedly less enigmatic, I'm sure. Agung's voice goes a little higher as he leans forward eagerly. Well, he asked me if I had ever experienced anything, out of the ordinary when I was living there. It's only then that I realize he's relating a story of his homeland to me. And in fact, to anyone, really, for the very first time. Before Agung can continue though, I quickly take out my recorder and ask him to start from the beginning. His uncle Faisal had lived in the apartment since the early 80s, nearly a decade after the government had converted the area's kampong into a housing complex. By the mid-90s, he was a happily married man, with 3 kids, 2 of whom were around Agung's age, which is why he chose to live next door to his sister and her family. Faisal loved his wife and children very much, but as with all parents, he definitely treasured his quiet time away from them too. It was a chilly October evening back in 1994. One of those rare evenings when he had their ground floor flat all to himself. His wife had taken their toddler out for a play date with her brother and his kids. His 2 older children, together with Agung, were staying over at a friend's place. He had no plans. There was no one around. There wasn't even a sound, except for the rustling of their curtains as a gentle breeze passed through their apartment. As much as he appreciated being alone though, Faisal decided it might have been a little too quiet for his liking. So, he put on one of his favorite rock albums from the 80s, laid down on the cold tile floor, closed his eyes, and let the wailing guitars, throbbing bass, and rhythmic drums wash over him. The music took him back, and he reminisced over how quickly time had flown by. From first moving into the apartment when he was a pimply teenager, blasting this album at full volume, much to his parents' chagrin, to being a family man who knew just the right volume to play his music without annoying his other neighbors. He smiled to himself, air drumming along to the album's third track, when suddenly he heard a faint sound from outside his flat. It wasn't a familiar noise like cars or kids playing. It sounded like a soldier barking orders. Faisal got up off the floor slowly. He lowered the stereo's volume a little more. Sure enough, mixed in with the low rumbling of distant thunder and the increasingly ferocious winds, was the sound of a soldier yelling commands. What made it stranger and more terrifying was that the orders were being yelled in Japanese. Hesitantly, Faisal crept towards the living room window, which faced a small field and river, across from which was a still undeveloped forested area. Peeking out, he saw two figures marching towards the apartment building. He didn't get a good look at their faces, almost as if they were perpetually shrouded in shadow. But he recognized their uniforms. They were the Kenpatai, the Japanese military police from World War II, Agung says, trying to maintain a level tone, but clearly still fascinated by what his uncle had told him. Although he had crouched down, Faisal could not look away, even as the soldiers grew closer. No matter how close they got, though, he still couldn't see their expressions, but he knew, almost on a primal level, that they were glaring angrily at him. Faisal only snapped out of his trance the moment the spectral soldiers raised their pistols and pointed them straight at him. Instinctively, he ducked for cover, just as he heard a loud bang, and the sky seemed to fill with blinding light. As the moment passed, he looked back up, out of the window. Nothing. The Japanese soldiers were gone. Eventually, he found the courage to head outside. As he made his way out, he started to suspect that he imagined the whole thing. That wasn't gunfire, he told himself. That was just the thunder. But when he got out to the field, and as it started to rain, Faisal stood shaking at the sight of what waited for him. 2 marks in the apartment building's wall, just below where his living room's window was. 2 marks that looked a lot like bullet holes. Faisal never told his wife or any of his kids what he had seen. He didn't even tell his sister or Agung's father. Instead, the following evening, he chased his family out of the house with some flimsy excuse and called someone over to bless the house, to protect it from any wandering or malicious spirits. He'd still see the soldiers again And again after that night though. But from then on, they would never be marching as close to his flat as they were before. Instead, they would always be on the other side of the river, on the edge of that thick forest. And even though he still couldn't see their faces clearly, he knew that they were glaring at him, angrier than ever. Agung tells me that Faisal wasn't sure why he never saw them before that night, but he did some research into that area. During the Japanese occupation of Indonesia, Semarang was the site of the infamous Pertempuran 5 Hari, or the 5 days battle. While the battle itself happened in what is now downtown Semarang, Faisal learned that the city's residents chased the Japanese out to rural and kampung areas. Areas just like Banyumanik. I asked Agung what he thinks of all of this. I know it's weird how excited I am about it, he says with a chuckle, then continues, slightly quieter. But I finally feel like I've got this connection to my roots, and this story felt like a huge part of it for some reason. That makes sense? I smile and tell him more than you know. If you want to discover more of Southeast Asia's other side, subscribe now and follow us on social media at We Are HANTU. You can also buy official merchandise on Redbubble and be one of our supporters on Patreon. Ghost Maps is recorded on Audio Technica mics.